In early April 1945, the Third Reich stood on the precipice of absolute catastrophe. The Soviet Red Army, numbering approximately 2.5 million troops, had massed along the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. To the west, American and British forces had shattered the Rhine defenses and were advancing virtually unopposed into the German heartland. The Eastern Front, once the source of German military pride, had become a bleeding wound that could no longer be stanched. Inside the Führerbunker, deep beneath the streets of Berlin, Adolf Hitler still clung to fantasies of miraculous salvation, unaware that a general would soon enter his presence and deliver words that would shatter the last remnants of his psychological defenses. This is the story of General Gotthard Heinrici, one of history's most underrated military minds, and his pivotal confrontation with Hitler during the final days of the Nazi regime. It is a narrative of military realism colliding with ideological delusion, of professional soldiers confronting the impossible, and of a leadership in complete moral and strategic bankruptcy. What occurred in those meetings in early April 1945 would ultimately contribute to the psychological unraveling of Adolf Hitler himself and expose the fundamental rottenness at the core of Nazi governance. The architect of defensive strategy. To understand the significance of Heinrici's role, we must first comprehend who this man was and why he had earned the respect, though never the affection, of Germany's military hierarchy. Gotthard Heinrici was born in 1886 and represented the old Prussian officer corps tradition, methodical, professional, and devoted to the principles of sound military science rather than ideological fervor. By March 1945, after 3 decades of military service, Heinrici had established himself as perhaps the finest defensive tactician in the entire German army, a reputation earned not through flashy offensive maneuvers, but through careful study, innovative engineering, and an almost prescient ability to anticipate enemy movements. Unlike many generals who had either capitulated entirely to Hitler's increasingly detached from reality or had entered into conspiracies against him, Heinrici maintained a position of principled professionalism. He understood that defending Germany was not about Nazi ideology, but about protecting the nation's remaining territory, and, insofar as was possible, preserving German soldiers' lives. His philosophy could be summarized simply: if one must defend, defend intelligently, economically with resources, and with maximum effect. In January 1942, during the catastrophic Russian winter offensive near Moscow, Heinrici had pioneered what military historians now recognize as a revolutionary defensive doctrine. When faced with massive Soviet attacks that threatened to overwhelm his positions, Heinrici implemented a strategy of deliberate tactical withdrawal, combined with prepared secondary defensive lines. Rather than defending positions to the last man as Hitler demanded, Heinrici would withdraw his forces during the night to carefully prepared rear positions, allowing Soviet artillery bombardments to fall on empty ground the next morning. When Soviet infantry and tanks advanced into what they believed were occupied positions, they encountered minefields, obstacles, and concentrated German counterattacks that caught them unprepared and disorganized. This technique, often called elastic defense by military theorists, proved devastatingly effective precisely because it violated Hitler's standing orders. Heinrici had managed to maintain his position and even advance his career because his tactical flexibility, though covert, undeniably preserved German forces and inflicted disproportionate casualties on the enemy. However, this success came at a cost. Hitler never trusted him, never favored him, and never promoted him to positions of supreme command commensurate with his abilities. In many ways, this lack of favor may have been fortunate. It kept Heinrici somewhat isolated from the inner Nazi leadership circle and freed him from complicity in many of the regime's most heinous decisions. The appointment to Army Group Vistula on March 20th, 1945, General Heinrici received his most crucial and most difficult assignment. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Vistula, replacing none other than Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and one of Hitler's oldest and most loyal associates. This appointment was significant for multiple reasons. First, it represented an implicit acknowledgment that military expertise, not ideological fervor or political loyalty, was now desperately needed to have any hope of slowing the Soviet advance. Second, Heinrici's appointment over Himmler was a quiet humiliation for the SS chief, though one that would have far-reaching consequences in Hitler's final days. Upon assuming command, Heinrici immediately recognized that the situation was far graver than the High Command had admitted. The Oder Front, stretching approximately 150 kilometers from Frankfurt to the mouth of the river, was defended by German formations that lacked adequate equipment, ammunition, trained personnel, and reserves. The Ninth Army, positioned southeast of Berlin and expected to face the main Soviet assault, was in marginally better condition than the Third Panzer Army to the north, which was in precarious circumstances and would almost certainly collapse under the weight of a sustained Soviet offensive. Heinrici's assessment of the strategic situation was devastatingly accurate. The best panzer units that remained in his sector, crucial mobile reserves that could potentially plug any Soviet breakthrough, had been withdrawn and sent to the Prague area based on a fundamentally flawed assessment that the Soviets would launch their main offensive toward Czechoslovakia rather than toward Berlin. This removal of reserves meant that Heinrici lacked the means to respond to a major breakthrough anywhere along his extensive front. If the Soviet offensive broke through at any point, the collapse would be catastrophic and immediate. However, Heinrici was not a man to despair. Instead, he applied his considerable talents to what seemed like an impossible task. Over the following weeks, he constructed an extraordinary defensive system along the Oder. Understanding that the Oder River itself would present initial obstacles to Soviet crossings, Heinrici instructed engineers to deliberately flood the surrounding plain, transforming it into a swamp by releasing water from upstream reservoirs, a technique that exploited the spring thaw. Behind this natural barrier, he constructed 3 successive belts of defensive positions extending back toward Berlin itself. The innermost positions were known as the Botan Line. These defensive preparations represented the application of Heinrici's lifetime of experience. Anti-tank ditches were dug at precise intervals. Anti-tank gun emplacements were carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire, and extensive networks of trenches and bunkers were constructed. Heinrici even managed to concentrate greater forces at the Seelow Heights, located approximately 17 kilometers west of the Oder and 90 kilometers east of Berlin. Recognizing instinctively that this terrain offered the best opportunity to slow and disrupt a Soviet assault. Yet despite these preparations, Heinrici remained acutely aware that they were insufficient. Without adequate reserves, without sufficient ammunition, without proper training for his troops, many of whom were either very young or very old, hastily conscripted into the Volkssturm. The task before him was fundamentally impossible. The Red Army would eventually break through, and Berlin would fall. The only questions were when and at what cost. The fateful meeting in the Führerbunker. In the first week of April 1945, Hitler summoned Heinrici to Berlin for a situation conference in the Führerbunker. This was a meeting that Heinrici had been dreading, knowing that he would be confronted with demands for unrealistic assessments and pressured into providing assurances of victory that would be false. The atmosphere in Berlin was already tense to the point of suffocation. The Soviets were visible from the city's outskirts. The sound of artillery was audible. The Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent, and the population of the capital was increasingly living in fear and privation as the bombardment continued relentlessly. The participants in this crucial conference included General Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the OKW, German Armed Forces High Command, General Alfred Jodl, the Operations Chief, Field Marshal Wilhelm Burgdorf, General Hans Krebs, Chief of the General Staff, and, of course, Hitler himself. Also present were Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, and Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the three men whom Heinrici would describe as having turned the conference into an auction of false promises. When Hitler finally entered the conference room, Heinrici was shocked by his appearance. The German leader looked physically and mentally destroyed. According to Heinrici's own recollections, Hitler seemed like a man who had no more than 24 hours to live, and resembled a walking corpse. The trembling hands, the glazed eyes, the shuffling gait all testified to a leader whose mind and body were in advanced stages of collapse. Hitler was no longer capable of understanding complex military situations or of making rational strategic decisions. He was a prisoner of his own propaganda, his own fantasies, and his own desperate hope against all evidence that some miracle would yet save the Third Reich. Krebs began the briefing and then gave way to Heinrici, who immediately began to describe in carefully measured tones the actual situation facing the German forces. Heinrici's approach was deliberately gradual. He knew that shocking Hitler with the full truth all at once might simply trigger an irrational response. Instead, he began by describing the disposition of the two armies defending the Oder, explaining that while the Ninth Army had received extensive reinforcements and preparations, the Third Panzer Army to the north was in very precarious condition and could not be expected to withstand a Soviet attack. Heinrici continued by explaining with brutal clarity the shortages that plagued his forces, a lack of weapons of all types, insufficient ammunition, inadequate tanks, severe fuel shortages, and perhaps most crucially, an absence of properly trained or experienced soldiers. Many of his troops were veterans of previous battles who had seen years of combat. Others were old men from the Volkssturm or Hitler Youth members barely in their teens. This mixture could not be relied upon to withstand concentrated bombardment followed by coordinated assault by veteran Soviet formations. The German officers present began to stir uncomfortably as Heinrici laid bare the truth in a manner that was almost shocking in its directness. They were simply not accustomed to anyone speaking to Hitler with such candor about the actual state of affairs. The usual practice was to employ euphemism, to present optimistic interpretations of bad news, and to express confidence in final victory regardless of what the facts suggested. When Krebs attempted to reassure Heinrici that he would receive all necessary reinforcements in the coming weeks, Heinrici's response was blunt. He did not believe this promise was realistic, and even if reinforcements arrived, they would lack proper training and combat experience. At this point, Hitler attempted to engage in debate, suggesting that the Soviets were throwing their last reserves into the assault, and that these forces were of poor quality, which would balance the situation. Heinrici contradicted him flatly. The Soviet forces were not depleted. They were not of poor quality. They were not at the limit of their capabilities. In fact, the Red Army remained at the height of its strength, with experienced veteran formations that had fought their way from the depths of Russia and across Eastern Europe. There would be no Soviet collapse to rescue the German position. The auction of promises. At this critical moment, as Heinrici's words hung in the air like an indictment, Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal of the Luftwaffe, attempted to salvage his standing with Hitler by making a dramatic gesture. "My Führer," Göring proclaimed, "I will immediately place 100,000 Luftwaffe men at your disposal. In a few days they will appear on the Oder Front." It was an offer that Heinrici would later recognize as utterly meaningless. Luftwaffe personnel with no ground training, no experience in defensive warfare, and with an air force that was essentially extinct on the Eastern Front would be worse than useless in a ground defense. They would be, as Heinrici later described it, cannon fodder. Not wanting to be outdone, Heinrich Himmler, despite being recently removed from command of Army Group Vistula, immediately offered his own contribution to this farcical competition for Hitler's favor. "The SS has the honor of providing another 25,000 fighters for the Oder Front," he declared, his face flushed with the excitement of performing loyalty before Hitler. These SS formations, often fanatical but frequently undertrained in proper military tactics, would similarly prove inadequate to the task before them. Finally, Grand Admiral Dönitz, not wishing to appear less committed than his rivals, added his own pledge, approximately 12,000 sailors, who would be immediately removed from their ships and sent to reinforce the Oder Front. Heinrici watched this spectacle with growing despair. The leaders of Nazi Germany had transformed a military briefing into what amounted to an auction house, with each participant bidding for Hitler's approval by making increasingly extravagant and unrealistic promises of reinforcements. When Hitler, influenced by these offers and apparently believing that 150,000 additional troops represented a substantial improvement to his situation, announced to Heinrici that you already have 150,000 men, that's approximately 12 divisions, there are your reserves. Heinrici's restraint finally cracked. He responded with barely concealed contempt that these troops were completely unprepared for ground combat, that they lacked proper training, and that they would serve only to increase casualties without contributing anything of military value to the defense of the Oder Front. This response infuriated Himmler, Göring, and Dönitz, who immediately defended the quality of their respective forces, each insisting that his contribution would be of the highest caliber. Heinrici remained unmoved, repeatedly emphasizing that these men would be sacrificed at the front without any positive result. What he desperately needed, he reiterated, was the return of the armored formations that had been stripped from his sector and sent to Prague. But Hitler, whether out of stubborn refusal to acknowledge the futility of the Prague strategy, or out of fear of Göring's and Himmler's objections, would not authorize the return of these crucial reserve formations. Hitler's final appeal and Heinrici's resignation. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Hitler attempted one final appeal to Heinrici, a psychological lever that reflected the German leader's belief that morale and willpower could somehow overcome material reality. "Colonel General," Hitler said, "I tell you that if you are convinced that this battle must be won, it will be won. If you manage to transmit this same belief to your troops, you will achieve victory, and with it the greatest success of the war." This statement represented the complete bankruptcy of Hitler's strategic thinking. He believed that will, faith, and ideological commitment could compensate for the complete absence of the material means to wage effective war. Heinrici, a professional soldier who had fought across Europe for years, understood that such sentiments, however emotionally compelling, were disconnected from military reality. Armies do not hold positions without ammunition. Soldiers do not withstand bombardment through moral force alone. Tanks cannot be replaced by enthusiasm. The laws of military science and physics were not subject to the manipulation of ideology. At this point, Heinrici realized that his mission had failed. He had not managed to penetrate Hitler's wall of delusion. The dictator would not accept the reality of the situation. The decision-making apparatus of Nazi Germany was too corrupted by personal rivalries, ideological blindness, and the personality cult surrounding Hitler to make any rational assessment of the actual military situation. The conference had not produced any useful outcome. It had only confirmed that the Nazi leadership was fundamentally incapable of rational response to the crisis confronting them. Heinrici gathered his papers, bade farewell to the assembled leaders, and prepared to return to his headquarters. But before departing Berlin and returning to the front, he spoke quietly to his assistant. According to the account that would later emerge, Heinrici said words that crystallized his despair at the situation. It's no use anymore. Everything is useless, all useless. The confirmation of disaster. Just 6 days later, on April 16, 1945, Heinrici's darkest predictions proved dismayingly accurate. The Soviet Red Army launched the final assault on the Oder Front. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front attacked from the east, while Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front assaulted from the south. The bombardment alone was apocalyptic. More than 20,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously on the German positions, creating a hurricane of steel and explosive force that few defensive positions in history could have withstood. Heinrici's defensive system, brilliant though it was, could only slow the Soviet advance. It could not stop it. The elastic defense tactics that had proven so effective in 1942 near Moscow could not indefinitely hold back 2.5 million Soviet troops equipped with overwhelming firepower. Within days, the German front had shattered, the Ninth Army was encircled and destroyed, the Third Panzer Army was pushed westward in desperate retreat. The reinforcements that Göring, Himmler, and Dönitz had promised proved to be as worthless as Heinrici had predicted. The Luftwaffe ground troops, lacking proper training and equipment, were mauled by veteran Soviet formations. The SS units, for all their fanaticism, could not overcome the mathematical reality of being outnumbered by forces many times their size. By April 23rd, Soviet forces had completed the encirclement of Berlin. The capital was now cut off, surrounded, and facing final assault. The Germans had approximately 100,000 defenders remaining in and around the city, a fraction of the millions needed to mount an effective defense against the overwhelming Soviet forces closing in from all sides. The Battle of Berlin would rage for the next 2 weeks, becoming one of the bloodiest urban engagements in military history. But the outcome had been predetermined by the collapse of the Oder Front, a collapse that Heinrici had accurately forecast. The aftermath and historical significance. For his refusal to participate in the increasingly delusional fantasy of Nazi leadership, and for his repeated, increasingly forceful warnings about the true state of the military situation, Heinrici would be relieved of his command on April 29, 1945, by General Keitel, ostensibly for disobeying Hitler's orders to mount a counterattack near Oranienburg that Heinrici correctly recognized as strategically pointless and tactically suicidal. Heinrici's successor would attempt to implement Hitler's orders, but by that point, the German army group Vistula was already disintegrating, and the last opportunity to preserve any organized German resistance had passed. Heinrici survived the war and died in 1971. His extraordinary contributions to German military science largely forgotten or minimized in post-war historical accounts, overshadowed by the much more dramatic stories of Nazi leaders like Rommel, Göring, or Himmler. Yet for anyone genuinely interested in understanding the final collapse of the Third Reich, Heinrici's role was crucial. He represents the triumph of professional military competence and realism over ideological delusion and wishful thinking. His meeting with Hitler in April 1945 was one of history's most significant military conferences, precisely because it demonstrated with crystal clarity the fundamental rottenness of Nazi governance. The words that Heinrici spoke in that bunker, delivered with careful professionalism, but with unmistakable clarity about the hopelessness of Germany's strategic situation, contributed directly to the psychological crisis that Hitler would experience in the final days, a crisis that accelerated the collapse of command authority and ultimately hastened the regime's end. History cannot know with certainty, but it is reasonable to suggest that Heinrici's devastating military assessment played a role in Hitler's ultimate psychological breakdown and his decision to end his own life just 15 days later, on April 30th, 1945. In the final analysis, the confrontation between General Heinrici and Adolf Hitler represented something far larger than a mere military briefing. It was a collision between reality and delusion, between professional military competence and amateur ideological fantasy, between a soldier who saw war as a science to be understood rationally, and a leader who believed that will and ideology could transcend the material facts of warfare. Heinrici's warnings went unheeded, but history has ultimately vindicated his analysis. The Soviet forces did indeed break through the Oder. Berlin did fall. Germany did experience total, unconditional defeat. And the greatest error of Nazi leadership was not their original decision to wage war, but their fundamental refusal, even in the final moments, to acknowledge the reality of their situation and to seek terms that might have saved even a portion of their nation from total destruction.